First, I would like to reiterate the thanks which David gave to our hosts, not only here in London, but throughout our journey through this great country from the farthest frozen reaches of Glasgow. It was quite sunny and warm, actually, to here in the deep south. And to thank Karma as well. It's great to see you again, and it's really wonderful to be here. This is a very politically aware and astute country. When we arrived in Leeds, I said to our hosts, we had a bit of time, they said, "What would you like to do?" I said, "I would like to buy a UK mobile phone, because roaming on my American phone is very expensive and it's cheaper to just buy a UK phone." They said, "Well, that's fine, but you can't go to Vodafone because we're boycotting it." I said, "That's fine, we don't have to go to Vodafone, there's many other companies." Then we said, they said, "Well, what do you want to do now?" I said, "Well, we could go to the university." They said, "Well, we can't go till 6 o'clock because there's a strike and we can't cross the picket line." I said, "Okay, that's fine. We would never want to cross a picket line, so we'll go and have a cup of tea somewhere else." And then I sat down here, I found a bottle of water, and someone stuck a post-it note on it. I don't know who. Oh, okay, very good. And it says, "Evian is one of the companies benefiting from the occupation." So every step of the way, there's political education and awareness in this country, which is commendable. And I understand that on Saturday there's a plan to turn Trafalgar Square into Tahrir Square. Someone in Birmingham told us that people were coming on coaches from all over the country. I had a look at Trafalgar Square today. It's a little bit small compared to Tahrir Square, but I hope it will be suitable anyway. You can always spread to other squares if necessary. So now I've used up about 2/3 of my time. In the remaining few minutes, I want to just give an overview of some thoughts about the situation in Palestine and the context in which we are waging our struggle for liberation, for an end to apartheid, for justice, for equality. I want to reflect that during this visit, this is Israeli Apartheid Week, and just visiting universities in this country, I'm struck how Israeli apartheid is exported to universities here through the experiences of some of the Palestinian students I've met. David described some of the ways British universities, like American and Canadian and other universities, cooperate with Israeli universities. That's one way apartheid is supported and exported. But I think about the young woman I met in Leeds, at Leeds University, who was born in Jerusalem, and her family lives in Jerusalem. And she, every time she goes home, she is terrified that the Israelis will confiscate her Jerusalem ID and exile her forever, because Israel treats the indigenous Palestinian people of Jerusalem as if they were foreign visitors, and if they leave the country to study for a year or so, they're considered to have abandoned their residency. Of course, the racist apartheid state of Israel applies completely different standards to any person it identifies as a Jew, who is invited to come to Jerusalem to take the place of that Palestinian and to be treated as if they were indigenous. So Israel reverses the relationship. The indigenous people are treated as temporary visitors, and the settlers are treated as if they were natives. So I met that young woman at Leeds University. And also at Leeds University, I met a young man from Gaza studying environmental sciences. And his family had lived for many years and still live in the United Arab Emirates. And he returned to Gaza about 5 or 6 years ago. And then with great difficulty, he managed to leave Gaza in order to come and study in the UK, having already lost one scholarship at another university because he wasn't able to leave Gaza, but eventually getting another one at Leeds. But what really touched me and struck me about his situation is that because he and his family are stateless, they haven't seen each other in more than 6 years. He cannot go to the United Arab Emirates because he's stateless and they won't give him a visa. And his family can't leave the United Arab Emirates because if they leave, they won't be allowed back. So I was struck by the choice that this young man had to make between his education and his family. And this is a choice that Israeli apartheid imposes on so many Palestinians. And it's one of the silent costs when we talk about academic boycott and the freedom of Israeli academics to do as they please, and that academia is sacred. We never really take into account the cost of Israeli apartheid on Palestinians. And I know there are other students here tonight in the audience from Gaza who have faced exactly the same situation. And I wanted to stress that because many of you are students, and so this is not a hypothetical thing. The apartheid is here in your universities as well. I think, very briefly, we can think of the history of Palestine in 3 periods spanning roughly 20 years each, give or take. And very briefly, I'll mention what these are. 1948 to 67, the establishment of the State of Israel on Palestine through ethnic cleansing, through the violent expropriation of most of the country and the expulsion of 90% of the indigenous people from their land. The establishment phase, I'll just leave it at that. 1967 to 87 was a period of glorious expansion for Israel. The expansion into the West Bank and Gaza Strip, into Egypt, the Sinai, and into southwest Syria, the Golan Heights. Israel tripled in size. It began to colonize. It began to exploit these territories. Israelis boast about how they used to go to Jericho and Bethlehem for shopping and for hummus, places they would mostly never dare to tread today. And Palestinians were a source of cheap and reliable labor throughout the country. That period ended with the beginning of the First Intifada in 1987, which lasted until 1993. And the period that began in 1993 until with the Oslo Accords, and that has lasted until today, but which I believe is ending now, is what I think of as the period of managed or luxury occupation for Israel. This is where, the dirty work of the occupation is done to a great extent by Palestinians themselves through the creation of a so-called Palestinian Authority, which Palestinians were conned into believing was going to be the nucleus for an independent state, but turned out to be a native auxiliary for the colonial occupation forces, very much on the British model. When you had the British Empire, and by the way, the imperial buildings on the Strand, really just fantastic reminders of that empire. But this tiny little country could not supply sufficient occupation and colonial policing forces for its vast empire, so it hired native auxiliaries in India, in Africa, in Palestine, commanded usually by British officers, to control the local population. And that's exactly the model followed by the Palestinian Authority, except the officers aren't Israeli. They are, in fact, it's under American supervision, and also, to a great extent, under British supervision, because the British involvement in the police mission in the West Bank, and as David was pointing out at a meeting earlier in the week, that the British have actually sent some of their very finest senior officers from the former Royal Ulster Constabulary to Palestine, and who are now training the Palestinian security forces who are abusing Palestinian human rights and assisting the occupation. So that's one aspect of the luxury occupation. The other, as you know, under international law, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, the occupying power is legally required to supply the basic needs of the population it occupies. Well, Israel's occupation is really a five-star occupation for Israel, because the genius of it is that you get someone else to pay, primarily the European Union. The European Union is the proud sponsor of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. They pay most of the costs of it. They pay for most of the salaries of the Palestinian Authority. They pay for the infrastructure that Israel neglects. Israel destroys and bombs things that the Europeans have built, and the Europeans, like suckers, pay up again and again while rubbing their hands and saying, we support the peace process. But what they're doing is subsidizing the occupation, subsidizing the apartheid, paying for it while remaining silent and complicit. I believe this period is coming to an end. It's all coming unstuck. The cover story for this was what they called the peace process. That, well, we have negotiations, and you don't like settlements, so come talk about settlements. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu loves the peace process. He keeps saying, we're begging the Palestinians, please come and negotiate. Why won't you come and negotiate? You hurt our feelings when you don't come and negotiate. Israel is very sensitive. You have to take its feelings into account. This cover has been blown. It's been blown because after 2 decades of fake negotiations in which Palestine has been colonized and brutalized, and more people have been expelled from Jerusalem, and Gaza has been placed under a criminal and cruel and murderous blockade, a vindictive punishment. Gaza is now the scapegoat for everything. Yesterday, a bomb was set off in Jerusalem. Nobody knows who did it. Nobody's claimed responsibility. And immediately, Israeli minister was threatening cast lead too. Today in Haaretz, I didn't have access to a printer, but there was a front page story about how, you have to read this in the Haaretz, you won't get it in the Guardian or the New York Times, about how Israel is responsible for the latest escalation of violence, that Israel provoked it. And nevertheless, the BBC, the Guardian, all the mainstream media are faithfully reporting that Israel is retaliating for rocket strikes. The cover story of the peace process is blown. So where does this leave the major actors, to use that term? Well, the Palestinians. On the one hand, the Palestinians themselves, you could say, are in the worst shape that they've been in a long time. They're geographically separated and dispersed, politically divided. People are talking about unity. We've seen some of the young people in Gaza and the West Bank rising up and calling for unity. And Hamas and Fatah-led authorities uniting in trying to suppress those protests. And I believe that those protests reflect a deep desire for unity among Palestinians. In fact, they reflect a reality of unity among Palestinians, that Palestinians are very much united on how they see their goals and their history and their conflict. But unity in terms of political entities and institutions requires more than just calling for an end to division. It requires a recognition of, what was it Tony Blair said when he came to office? You have to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. And this was his, cover for, introducing ever more right-wing policies. But you have to be tough on division and tough on the causes of division. But first you have to recognize what those are. You have to recognize that Oslo created a situation in which a significant part, the once dominant part of the Palestinian national movement, has become a subsidiary of the occupation. This is the painful reality that Palestinians must confront internally. You cannot have it both ways. If Hamas and Fatah is a fighting couple, the third person in the marriage is the occupation. And the Palestinian Authority is a creature of the occupation. You cannot have unity between occupation and resistance. It doesn't function. So it goes back to the rotten structure created by the Oslo Accords. And we need unity around principles, not movements, not around personalities, not around political figures, but around principles. And I believe that the principles set out in the 2005 Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions are truly the principles that unite all Palestinians. And many of them you will know what they are, but for those who don't, I'll state them. First, an end to the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands occupied by Israel in 1967. Second, full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. 1948 Palestinians. 1.4 million people left behind in what became Israel and their descendants. And third, the rights of refugees, including the rights of return. I challenge you to find any Palestinian anywhere who disagrees with those three basic principles. And the problem is with the dominant political movements now is none of them, whether they're working with the occupation or against it, none of them is putting forward a program and a strategy that unites all Palestinians around those goals. And I think that's why we're seeing Palestinians beginning to ask, they're coming out of the stupor that Oslo put over them, in which our job was to sit and to wait for the prophets of the peace process to deliver us from this situation. And Palestinians themselves, at the grassroots, in Palestine and in the diaspora, are beginning to wake up and to say it's our job to determine our future and to represent ourselves. The challenge, though, is there is no framework or political structure to do this. The PLO still exists on paper, but in practice, it doesn't function. And so that, I think, is a huge challenge for all Palestinians. But at the same time, the BDS call really does provide a basis not only for Palestinians to rebuild their political unity, but for their appeal for solidarity for the rest of the world. Israel. Where does this situation, the end of the luxury occupation, leave Israel? I think it leaves Israel at a complete ideological dead end. There was never really any justification for I mean, you could never really back up Zionist arguments, but they delayed the reckoning that we have now through the disguise of the peace process. Now we're at the end of that, and Israel is unmasked for what it is, a settler colonial entity that was created and maintained through ethnic cleansing, dispossession, and oppression of the indigenous people. It's unmasked as that. Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister, is not a new phenomenon. He is the true face of Israel that is now proclaimed openly. We see that Zionism has shifted. In the West, in Europe and in North America, Zionism was once a very respectable, liberal, progressive, and even leftist ideology. In this country, the Labour Party was the principal Zionist party in the country. And The Guardian has always been a reliably Zionist newspaper until today, to a great extent. So there's a strong tradition of left and liberal Zionism. And I would argue that the longevity of support for Israel in the West is due to the fact that Israel was able to convince people, or Zionists were able to convince people, that it was a progressive ideology. And what we see now, which I think is a significant and historic shift that has been going on for some years, but particularly since the September 11th, 2001 attacks, is a very deliberate alliance between extreme racist, xenophobic, and Islamophobic right-wing forces in Europe and North America with Zionism. That Israel invested, and Zionists invested in those relationships, believing they would be a guarantee of long-term support. Because after 2001, Israel saw that these forces were in the ascendant. They were calling the shots, the invasion of Iraq, of Afghanistan. They could invest and harvest the anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe and encourage it, promote Islamophobia, and say, look, now you understand what we face. We face the same threat. But I think, and I hope, despite the very worrying trends of racism in Europe and North America, that this strategy is somewhat limited. In the United States, I can talk less about Europe, but in the United States, the hard right, the George Bush's base, is probably about 30 to 35% of the population who would vote for George Bush or someone to the right of him no matter what. But that's not enough to ensure long-term support. You need a majority. And what we see is that Israel has boxed itself into that corner. And now, the English Defense League shows up at pro-Israel rallies. Or they bring Israeli flags to EDL rallies. And the same is true in the United States when we see these lunatic rallies against creeping Sharia, as they call it in the United States. They bring Israeli flags. The alliance has been cemented. And it's an ideological prison for Israel. And they're trying to break out of it. They're trying to break out of it with marketing strategies, the Rebrand Israel campaign, which try to win back the progressive and liberal base that Zionism has lost, I believe, forever. And this involves, as David mentioned, the things like presenting Israel as high-tech, as green, as gay-friendly, supposedly a contrast to all the things Arabs and Muslims are not. But the problem is that all of Israel's strategies and options are negative. Obviously, violence and terror on a systematic scale is their main tool. But others include simply outlawing history. As 2 days ago, Israel passed a law making it illegal to commemorate the Nakba, the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. The laws that are currently underway to make it illegal to advocate for boycott. Other racist laws, decrees, and practices, for example, the 300-odd municipal rabbis, salaries paid by the State of Israel, who decreed that, it's ironic since they're against boycott, but that Jews should be boycotted if they rent or sell homes to Arabs. So, in contrast to Palestinians, who are speaking a language of universal rights and their allies, Israel is speaking a language of hatred, of bigotry, of demonization and dehumanization of others. And then finally, I know my time is up. 2 points. I think, and then of course there's the broader context now of the Arab revolutions and uprisings and the counter-revolutions, which are a real factor as well. Perhaps we'll have time to talk in the Q&A. But just to mention that, as an additional factor, all of these factors together, all of these trends, give me a great deal of confidence that this struggle can succeed. You know, if you game this out and you put yourself in the position of the Israelis, you cannot come up with a winning strategy that rescues Israel as a so-called Jewish and democratic state, actually a racist apartheid state, far into the 21st century. But the outcome is not certain. It depends on us. The question of how long Israeli apartheid will last is a question of how long we will allow the UK and the US and Canada and the EU to tolerate and support it, which is why the importance of the BDS movement. The question of whether there will be a caste-led, Operation Caste-led 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 is if you allow your country here to change its law to make this country a safe haven for Israeli war criminals like Tzipi Livni. And this is going through the House of Commons now. Next Wednesday. So everybody tomorrow should write or email or call their MP and say, I'm concerned about this issue and I want to make sure you vote to maintain the law as it is so that there's an independent judiciary that can decide if there are grounds to arrest a war crime suspect in this country. The final thing I want to say is that for many of us, Palestine has been our life, and we have been part of this struggle for many years, some of us for decades, and we've gotten used to thinking of this as a long-term struggle where perhaps in 30 or 50 or 100 years we might see some outcome. I think we need to change the way we think. If 1994 was the date of the first democratic election in apartheid, post-apartheid South Africa, then I think the year for us now, in terms of Palestine, is about 1988. We have to think in those terms. That the end of apartheid in Palestine, the end of this brutal system, the fulfillment of the demands of the Palestinian people expressed in the BDS call can be fulfilled in the next few years. Not just in the lifetimes of the young people in this room, but in the lifetimes of the first generation of Palestinians who survived the Nakba. I believe that it is their right and our responsibility to make sure they see justice in their lifetimes. Thank you.